Quebec Anglophone Heritage Network. I'm going to take a few moments to tell you about QAHN. We are a nonprofit organization whose mission is to preserve and promote the history, heritage, and culture of Quebec, and in particular of English-speaking communities that are spread right across the province. If you go to our website at QAHN.org, you'll discover a wide range of activities and projects that we are involved in. All of our projects, including Heritage Talks Online, are successful in large part because of our generous support that we receive from our community of supporters, including you. And thank you very much for joining us this evening. We could not do what we do without you. You're welcome to become a member of QAHN, and membership is open to community groups and heritage organizations as well. So please check our website on how to do that. You can also discover all the projects that we're involved in and to keep up to date with what we're doing and to discover and connect with community groups right across our network. Membership enables us to provide quality workshops, programs, and projects that you cannot find anywhere else, including our publication called Quebec Heritage News. It's a really fabulous publication that comes out 4 times a year, and it's filled with really well-written articles and images about Quebec's history. So if you're interested in history, you love a good read, and you'd like a copy of your own, you want to find out about places and people and events that you probably have never heard of in history textbooks, then please come and join our community and be a part of our great network. For first-time new members, you can take advantage of a special 30% discount promotion for a 1-year membership. If you're joining us on Facebook, please send us a private message on our Facebook page saying that you would like to join and claim the discount. And if you're on Zoom tonight, you can send us a message through the chat box. But take note, this offer is only valid for the length of the broadcast this evening. So you have to get your order in to be a member. I'd like to thank our funders who help make our projects possible, including Canadian Heritage, the Secretariat for Relations with English-Speaking Quebecers, the Chalkers Foundation, the Zeller Family Foundation, and the Townshippers Foundation. Thank you very much. The Heritage Talks Online series has a really great lineup of speakers, and you can find out the times of broadcast and the speakers right on our Heritage Facebook page. And you don't have to be a member of Facebook. You don't have to have your own page or have your own account. All of our broadcasts are available just by going to the Facebook page at the time indicated and watching us on Facebook Live. Or you can join us by Zoom by clicking the pre-registration link that you'll see on the posts on the Facebook page. We're going to be accepting questions at the end of our speaker's presentation tonight. And so if you're on Facebook Live, you can type them into the comment section and Glenn will ask them on your behalf to our speaker. And if you're on Zoom, at the end, you can use the raise hand feature, which is just at the bottom of the Zoom window, just right of center under the reactions tab, or just go old school and wave your hand and you can ask your question at the end. For the time that the speaker is speaking, though, we ask you to keep muted and your videos off. But at the end, it would be great if you turned your videos back on and we can create a nice community and get some conversation going. Well, I'd like to introduce you to our speaker this evening. Many of you know Fergus Keyes. Fergus was born and raised in Montreal and absolutely loves his 100% Irish heritage. Retiring after a successful career in senior management positions in the Canadian private security industry, he earned a degree as a chartered director with a specialty in board and governance issues. Fergus has served on a number of nonprofit boards and is currently the secretary of the board for Alzheimer's Montreal and a board member for the Quebec Anglophone Heritage Network. He is also enthusiastically involved in the efforts of the Montreal Irish Monument Park Foundation to build a memorial space around the Black Rock. His presentation tonight is called Meet Your Irish Neighbours, Irish Quebecers Who Made a Difference. Fulcha, Fergus.
Oh, there I am, so you can hear me.
Yes, hello, welcome.
Thank you. So I guess we'll start with my little presentation here. Let me see if I can open up the, there we go. And we'll do this. And we'll do this. And we're off and running. Okay, so thank you, Heather. Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, QAHN, for allowing me this opportunity to speak about one of my favorite subjects, the Irish in Quebec. As I was preparing and doing research for it, I came across, I guess, two kind of problems, you might say. The first difficulty is that there were so many Irish involved in so much stuff in Quebec that if I were to list them all, we would be here all night. So really, I just picked 20 that I thought give you an idea of different places that you could find Irish in Quebec history. The second thing is that many of the individuals I'm going to speak about tonight are so interesting that actually I could talk about them for 20 minutes. Some probably would even qualify for a QAHN talk on their own. So if after I'm finished, there is somebody that you think is really important that I missed, or if you think I talked about someone and forgot a point about them, please do add it into the discussion or send a comment if you're on Facebook. It should be fun. Okay, so here we go with a little presentation. So quite often when I've given a talk on the Irish in Quebec, I start with this guy, Paddy Cornelius O'Brien. Now, he was born in Kilkenny, ended up joining the Irish Brigade in France. The interesting thing about him is that he gets to be considered the very first Irish person in Quebec. There was really likely a lot of other Irish around, but he gets that distinction simply because his name appears on the very first census that was taken in Ville-Marie or Nouvelle-France over 350 years ago in 1663. So it does show simply that the Irish have been here a very long time. O'Brien, actually, his name went through, if you look at the records, he went through a number of different names, but he ended up basically becoming Pierre Aubry, and that's the name that he was buried under, Pierre Aubry. He married Phil de Bois, one of the king's daughters, one of the young ladies that was sent to Nouvelle-France to help populate the area, a woman by the name of Jean or Janine Chartier. And they went on to have 7 children, 4 of whom lived to adulthood. And they in turn went on to have a whole bunch of descendants that are still spread all around North America today with the family name of Aubry. So you do have to wonder how many of these Aubrys have the slightest idea that they're really an O'Brien, so they're really Irish. So I always give a little tip of the hat to O'Brien, Aubry, and the first Irish guy to be officially noted way back 350 years ago in the territory. So moving ahead, there were a number of Irish things, of course, a number of historical things that happened in Quebec. And in every single one of them, some Irish people were involved to some degree. Here's a little quote. It's not that the Irish are cynical, it's simply that they have a wonderful lack of respect for everything and everybody. So the first guy I'd like to speak about is Guy Carleton. Now, Guy Carleton is really an interesting guy and probably one of the ones that could be considered for a full QAHN talk. He was Irish, of course. He had 3 brothers. They all served in the British Army, and they were at the Plains of Abraham at the time when the English took over the territory from the French. During that battle, interesting enough, there was a lot of Irish fighting on both sides. The French had a lot of Irish with them. The British had a lot of Irish with them. Maybe the Irish figured, listen, if you're going to pay me, I'll fight for you. I don't care which side. But whatever, there were a lot of Irish on both sides. Now, Guy Carleton gets interesting because he didn't come from a wealthy family in Ireland by any means. So it could be perhaps because of his personality, or he made a number of very high-level contacts during his career in the British Army. But for whatever reason, he was appointed Quebec governor, or governor of Lower Canada, actually twice, each time for a 10-year period. So he was the governor from 1768 to 1778. He was the governor again from 1785 to 1795. And I think the second time he was also the governor of all British North America. That encompassed all the British colonies at that time that existed in North America. Now it gets kind of interesting again, and it's hard to understand precisely why, but I suspect that maybe because Guy Carleton knew the area, whereas probably everybody else in the British Parliament had not the slightest idea where Canada or where Lower Canada was exactly. Or perhaps they shared the French idea that Canada was really nothing more than 40 arpents de neige, 4 arpents of snow. But for whatever reason, when it came time to put some rules down on paper, Guy Carleton got to do all the writing. And it ended up being the Quebec Act of 1774. Interesting enough, this Quebec Act is actually a foundation of many other similar documents, right up to the Constitution that we enjoy today in Canada. So he got to put in whatever he wanted. And it would seem that, again, because he spent so much time in Lower Canada, that he kind of ended up maybe thinking like the French Canadians were kind of cool or something. But for whatever reason, he really, really liked them. So contrary to what the British did in any other case when they walked in and bulldozed over another group and brought in language and whatever they felt like doing, Guy Carleton demanded that there be legal written guarantees for the French citizens of Lower Canada. That included a guarantee for their language, a guarantee for their religion, of course being Catholic, a guarantee that the French enjoy their civil law, which still continues on in Quebec to this day, and in general that their culture be allowed to survive. So in reality, maybe, someone who's a Quebec nationalist might want to hang a picture of Guy Carleton, who of course became the first Baron of Dorchester. Might want to hang his picture in their living room. At any rate, of course, no good deeds go unpunished. So the main street in Montreal that carried his name for so long, Dorchester Street, was, except for a small part in Westmount, was unceremoniously removed and replaced by René Lévesque. So go figure. But whatever case, the French do owe to this Irish gentleman the thanks for the protection of their language and rights. So I think Guy is or Guy, or Dorchester, or whatever you want to call him, is really an important Irish figure in Quebec history. So moving along, the second main event, historical event, of course, in Quebec was probably the rebellions of 1837, 1838 in Lower Canada. A similar event went on in Upper Canada, of course. And there's a lot of misunderstanding in history about this rebellion. There's been some revisionist stuff going on where people want to say, oh, it was an English-French thing, or some people even say, oh, it was an attempt to separate Lower Canada from Great Britain. Nonsense. In reality, it was about the old two things, money and power, that normally are often involved in political conflicts. So the idea was, who was going to control the Lower Canada Parliament? Was it going to be the elected officials, or was it going to be the people sent by England, the governor and his friends? So who was going to handle the purse strings of the entire operation? And that's really was the bottom of the rebellion. The second thing is that the rebellion really, at least 30% of the Patriotes were not French speaking. There were some English, there were some Scots, and there was a whole lot of Irish, including my own great-great-grandfather, by the way, who happened to be a patriot. Anyhow, I'm not going to speak about him, but I would like to speak about two individuals that were very much involved, Irish people who were very much involved in the rebellion of Lower Canada. And the first one is Daniel Tracey. Daniel Tracey is quite interesting. He trained as a doctor in Ireland, but he probably never actually practiced in Lower Canada. Not that I can find anyhow. What he did do is became the publisher of a very strong English-speaking patriot newspaper called The Vindicator. He was also a member of the Assembly, and his newspaper, of course, was very pro-patriot and very, very anti-establishment. So much so that him and his friend Duvernay, who published pretty much the same kind of a paper, but in French, both of them ended up being dragged off to jail for a month and charged with sedition. The public were not so pleased about this, and they had to let them go after a month. But Daniel Tracey, unfortunately, in 1832, cholera swept through Montreal, and Daniel Tracey himself actually caught it and died. So he wasn't really around to see the actual rebellion that happened some 5 years later, but he certainly planted enough seeds to get the thing going, and especially to get the Irish in, mostly, at least the Catholic Irish, mostly on the side of the rebellion. The other guy I'd like to speak about that was very much involved, an Irish guy involved again in the rebellion of Lower Canada, is Edmund Bailey O'Callaghan. O'Callaghan was in some ways kind of similar to Tracey in that he was also a doctor by profession. He does seem to have practiced to some degree in Lower Canada, but he was also a very close friend, and some people say partner, some people say right-hand man to Louis Joseph Papineau, who was the de facto leader of the rebellion in Lower Canada. Now, when Tracey died, of course, there was probably a little bit of toasting going on amongst the authorities because they finally got rid of this thorn in their side, but they didn't realize that O'Callaghan immediately took over the Vindicator and just carried on exactly where Tracey left off, being a general pain to the authorities. So he worked along and fought along with Papineau. However, when the fighting started, when the actual fighting started down St. Denis and St. Charles on the south shore of Montreal, when some bullets started to fly, both O'Callaghan and Papineau decided it would probably be better if they got the hell out of Canada. So they jumped the border and ended up in the United States. Papineau, of course, returned to Quebec and got very much involved in the politics. But O'Callaghan just actually stayed in New York and probably became a pain to the New York authorities instead of the Quebec authorities. So the next big event was the famine of 1847. I don't really have a specific guy. I will speak about somebody in a second, but I just wanted to at least make an honorable mention to the 12,000 Irish that maybe didn't actually have a chance to contribute to the history of Quebec. When I'm talking about the 12,000, more than 5,000 died in Grosse Ile, more than 6,000 died in Montreal, and they died in other locations like Quebec City. They also went on to die in Hingston and Cornwall and Ottawa and Toronto. So there was a lot of Irish that died during 1847. And there were a lot of caregivers of every language and religion and culture that went to help them. Many of those caregivers also caught typhus and died, including John Mills, who was not Irish and Catholic, but actually was the mayor of Montreal at the time, which kind of brings us to my next person, which is Father Patrick Dowd. Now, as I mentioned, a number of people went to help the sick and dying Irish in 1847, gave up their lives. And amongst them, well, first of all, St. Patrick's Church, which is now St. Patrick's Cathedral, opened on March the 17th, 1847. And that was actually basically weeks before the Irish arrived here in Montreal. And amongst the group of people that went to help them and gave up their lives, it included the majority of priests who had been assigned to St. Patrick's Church. If I remember right, I think it was 6 priests were assigned and 5 of them gave up their lives helping the Irish. It may have been 7 and 6 of them gave up their life. But to be a Catholic priest and to help out the sick and dying Irish during the famine was pretty much a death sentence, because under the Catholic religion, of course, they would lean over very closely to the victim to listen to their confession. And that in turn was really a death sentence. At any rate, so now you had St. Patrick's Church, just newly opened March 17th, 1847, and most of their priests have now died. So they put out an emergency call across North America and through Ireland, looking for priests that would come and replace the ones that had given up their life. And one of the guys that responded was Father Patrick Dowd. Father Patrick Dowd, born in Ottawa, came to Montreal, and then he did all kinds of stuff, much too much stuff to list. But for example, he opened St. Patrick's Orphanage. St. Patrick's Orphanage was originally opened to house some of the victims, the orphans of the Irish that died during the famine. And by 1900, well more than 5,000 children had spent all or part of their life in St. Patrick's Orphanage. He also opened a place called St. Bridget's Refuge for adults. St. Bridget's Refuge is interesting in that after he passed away, it became known as Father Dowd Refuge or Father Dowd Home. And today it still exists today under the name of Father Dowd CHSLD, a long-term care facility up in Notre Dame. So it's still an ongoing operation. The other thing interesting about Father Dowd is the Catholic Church decided that he should actually be a bishop. Now, I'm not entirely sure how it worked, but from my research, the way I understand it is for someone to become a bishop, the Vatican sends someone else with like a piece of paper, sort of like someone serving you a court document. It's like a bailiff or somebody that has to come and has to give this paper to the priest saying the Vatican has now made you a bishop. The problem was that Patrick Dowd didn't want to be a bishop. He just wanted to be a regular priest, parish priest, dealing with the Irish in Montreal, and he just didn't want to be a bishop. So apparently he spent a whole lot of time ducking this guy who was trying to serve him this paper to make him a bishop. And it happened twice until they gave up and just basically gave up on the whole idea of him becoming a bishop. But he was dancing around Montreal, hiding out on these guys. The other thing that's interesting about Patrick Dowd is for his good works like St. Patrick's Orphanage and the Refuge, except he raised millions and millions and millions of dollars. It would seem that if you were Catholic or non-Catholic, but if you had a few bucks in Montreal during the 50 years that he was a parish priest, he was coming to knock on your door and ask for a few bucks to do something. So he raised all these millions in today's money. But when he died, when he passed away, they're saying that his own stuff, the stuff that he owned, his own personal belongings, wouldn't have raised more than more than $10 at an auction. So Father Patrick Dowd, a really true humanitarian and a big contributor to the city of Montreal and to the Irish of Quebec and to Quebec society in general. So next one is Thomas D'Arcy McGee, because now we're up to 1867. And of course, this is Confederation time. I'm not going to speak too much about him because I know most of you are pretty familiar with D'Arcy McGee. He was the father of Confederation. I do find it interesting, though, that most countries in the world, large countries, became countries really based on a revolution, a rebellion, bullets, guns, blood, etc. But Canada is rather unique because Canada did not become a country through any kind of violence. Canada became a country through a whole lot of words and arguments and a fair amount of whiskey. And Thomas D'Arcy McGee liked to talk, liked to argue, and he kind of liked his whiskey. I've always thought it interesting. I know most of you probably know that quote, but John A. Macdonald, who was, of course, the first Prime Minister of Canada and very closely worked with D'Arcy McGee, also seemed to like his whiskey. And when something got out of hand, apparently called in D'Arcy McGee, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he said something like, "Listen, McGee, this cabinet has room for only one drunk, and I'm not giving up drinking." I always thought that was kind of cool. At any rate, as you all know, Thomas D'Arcy McGee was assassinated in 1868, and most likely by a member of the Fenians. So I guess at this point, I'm going to stop the presentation to make an announcement from our sponsors. the Finians that were apparently responsible for the murder of Tracey McGee are a really interesting group. And next week, right here, same place, same time, QAHN talk will be given by a friend, Keith Henderson, who is going to be talking entirely about the Finians. It should be really, really interesting. Most people don't really know much about the Finians. They hear the word, but they don't know. But it really, they were an interesting group for sure. So next week on March 23rd, at the same time, same place, Keith is going to talk about the Finians. So you should probably try and catch that. Okay, so returning to our normal programming. The next big event, of course, in the history of Quebec probably was the First World War. The First World War is interesting because there was a whole group of Canadians that were founded called the Irish Canadian Rangers. This group was made up almost entirely of Montrealers of Irish descent. The Rangers didn't last too long. A few years later, they were rolled into another regiment. But there were so many Irish involved in this Irish Canadian Rangers that I can't really highlight them all. So I just really picked this one gentleman, this Lieutenant Colonel, who actually was the founder of the Rangers, found the money, put it all together, and got it all set up. The other thing about him that some of you might be interested in is he was also apparently a very good athlete, a very well-known hockey player in his time, and he was named to the Hockey Hall of Fame in 1950. So another Irish guy that was very much involved. The last one in my series of people at very big historical events, and you might find this is really more of an honorable mention, but I thought I would throw it in, is James Cross. As many of you know, he just passed away recently at 99 years old. And James Cross was the British Trade Commissioner to Quebec in 1970, when he was kidnapped by the Front Libération du Québec, the FLQ, and held captive. So, you know, British Trade Commissioner, obviously he's British. No, he wasn't British. Actually, James Cross was Irish. He was born in Tipperary and took all his education at the Trinity College in Dublin. So I thought you just might find it interesting that even at that time, there was still someone of Irish descent involved and in the middle of the whole thing. So there were, of course, other notable Irish in Quebec that I can't really relate specifically to a single event, but let me just talk about a few of them. By the way, this is also a neat quote by Sigmund Freud saying that the Irish are one race of people for whom psychoanalysis is of no use. Figure that one out. Anyhow, next guy I'd like to talk about, and some of you probably know about him, is Charles McKiernan, also known as Joe Beef. So Charles McKiernan was a British quartermaster. He came to Lower Canada with the British troops. And as a quartermaster, his job was really to feed the troops. It was kind of a weird thing, but he had to go out and find the food to feed the troops. And for some reason, his guys, the guys that he was responsible for, always had some nice beef for supper. How Charles McKiernan actually got that beef is open for a little conjecture, and no one's quite sure how he managed to get all that beef. But at any rate, because of it, he ended up being called Joe Beef, a name that he himself stuck with and used in the future. Joe Beef was, again, another really interesting character that I could talk about for 20 minutes. I mean, he opened a canteen that eventually became known as the Joe Beef Canteen. It was another name before that. And, you know, as some of you know, he had a tendency to keep wild animals in the basement of his canteen, including bears and other wild animals. He also opened his doors to the homeless. So he would allow, actually on a cold winter night, he would send out his bartenders and people to work for him to see if there was any homeless sleeping on the streets. And he would bring them in and give them a bed in the upstairs of the canteen. He would make them always wash down before they got to bed, which was kind of unusual, and mainly because he just didn't want to change the sheets every day. And For that reason, he never had a death of any of these homeless in his little refuge that he had set up, versus the Grey Nuns and a few other homeless operations at the time. He also, at some point, the Lachine Canal workers went on strike. Most of the workers were Irish. There were a fair number of French also involved in digging out that canal. And when they went on strike, of course, there was no strike pay at that time. So Joe Beef supposedly supplied a minimum of 3,000 loaves of bread and 200 gallons of soup to keep the strikers eating. So he actually, one of his best quotes, the one that I quite like, that was given to a reporter when he was talking about who would be allowed service in his Joe Beef Tavern, he said, Beef said that no one would ever be refused service, no matter who he was, whether he was English or French or Irish or Negro or Indian or whatever religion he belonged to. And it was a pretty wide statement to be used in the mid-1800s. But at any rate, Joe Beef was another guy that, great humanitarian, did all kinds of stuff for Montreal and for Quebec. The next gentleman, John Williams, is somebody I've just heard about. I don't know a whole lot about him. I just find him really kind of interesting, and you might too. Williams was the eldest of 11 children, and he was born in Quebec City in 1834. And his father was Jamaican, and his mother was Catherine Quinn, who was Irish. So he's half Jamaican and half Irish. Apparently, he operated a barber shop in Quebec City for some 50 years. And he was a bit, I guess, of an intellectual or whatever. He spent hundreds of dollars to make sure that all major French English newspapers, all major US dailies, etc., were always available in his barber shop. So for 50 years, apparently became quite a cultural center in Quebec City. And people would go there to hang out and talk about the politics of the day and whatever was going on. So I think we have to mention John Williams as someone with Irish heritage in Quebec City who did some stuff. The next little item I'd like to talk about is Mary Gallagher. Again, some of you are probably quite familiar with Mary Gallagher. Mary Gallagher was murdered in 1879. As I say, the Irish were pretty much in every single profession you can imagine. Some of them were gangsters, and some of them were members of the oldest profession. And Mary Gallagher fell into the second category, and she shared a space with Susie Kennedy, who was a fellow prostitute. The story gets really interesting because it's almost an entirely Irish Montreal story. Some of it is fact and some of it is folklore. So in the folklore part of it, Mary Gallagher was murdered and she was also decapitated. So it says that every 7 years, Mary comes back to William Street, which is in Griffintown, looking for her head. And every 7 years, Irish Montrealers gather in the area to see if they can see Mary Gallagher walking around looking for her head. The other piece of folklore is that Michael Flanagan was a guy that Mary Gallagher and Susan Kennedy picked up in a bar on the night she was murdered. He was never charged with being involved in the murder, although a lot of people suspect he might have had something to do with it. At any rate, another bit of folklore is that a year later, he was working on a barge in the St. Lawrence River, and he fell off the barge and drowned. It was a very unique and weird accident, a little strange. And some people say that it was the ghost of Mary Gallagher that went there and pushed Michael Flanagan off the barge and into the river. Oh, that's the folklore part of Mary Gallagher. But there was, of course, a fact, and the fact is that she was indeed murdered and she was indeed decapitated. So although Michael Flanagan was not charged, Susie Kennedy was indeed charged. And then it became again almost like old Irish Home Week. She was arrested by Andrew Cullen, who was an Irish police officer, and she was dragged before the court in front of Judge Monk. And on the defense side was P.G. Coyle, and on the prosecution side was Bernard Devlin. Interesting, both Coyle and Devlin went on to be presidents of the St. Patrick's Society of Montreal, Bernard Devlin particularly is interesting because most presidents of St. Patrick's Society are there for maybe 1 or 2 terms. It looks like he was there maybe 4 terms, which is unusual. But at any rate, both of them were presidents of St. Patrick's Society. In the end, Susie Kennedy was indeed found guilty of the murder of Mary Gallagher, and she was sentenced to hang. And the Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald at the time, knocked off her sentence and changed it to life imprisonment. So instead of being hung, she was put into jail where she died. But it was really a whole Irish thing, and it continues to be a great deal of folklore about Mary Gallagher, Susie Kennedy, and the rest of them in Griffintown. But amongst those people involved, this whole list of characters that were involved in Mary Gallagher, one guy that I really find interesting that I'd like to talk about for a moment is Bernard Devlin, who, as I said, was the lawyer for the prosecution for the Crown in the case against Susie Kennedy. So he was a lawyer, of course, and one of the things that he said I always liked was justice and equality for all classes and creeds and undue favor to none. I always thought that should be, I guess, the way the justice system should work. But he again did all kinds of things, and could talk about him forever, really. And he's also one of these guys that pretty well forgotten to history, Bernard Devlin. But for example, he was a consultant to the American government under Abraham Lincoln. As I say, he was 4 times the president of St. Patrick's Society. So really, I really only have time to hit on one thing about him that I think is really interesting. It would seem like one day Devlin looked up and looked at the mountain in the middle of Montreal and said, you know, I think that mountain should be a public space, open to the public. He was both a city councilor and an alderman, and he proposed that Mount Royal become a park. Well, of course, most people thought he was crazy at the moment. So he had to fight for a very long time, about 7 or 8 years, to finally get the city of Montreal to agree to make Mount Royal a public space. Then he went on, because he was a lawyer, he ended up being the guy that ran around and purchased all the land that was from the people that owned it on Mount Royal. So he expropriated all this stuff and he built the park. And nobody ever remembers that Bernard Devlin is the one that really was responsible for Mount Royal Park in Montreal. So next time you're walking along in Mount Royal and on Mount Royal and you're having a good day, just think of Bernard Devlin. Without him, I'm not sure that there would be a Mount Royal Park in Montreal. He did lots of other stuff, but I'll move along here. So that was guys that were involved in, people that were involved mostly in politics or in historical events, etc. But again, the Irish in the arts and entertainment business were all over the place. And here's another little quote. She danced a jig, she sung a song that took my heart away. So let's talk about just some of the people, and there were a lot of them, that were involved in the arts and entertainment business. Well, of course, as the promotion for this talk mentioned, we have Le Bolduc, and it's hard to explain how popular Le Bolduc was in the 1930s. I mean, in reality, she was at least equal to the Céline Dion of today. She sang almost and performed almost entirely in French, but her real name, Le Bolduc, was really Mary Rose Ann Travers. Her father was from Ireland. He was actually an Anglophone. I don't believe he spoke French at all, but he was her music teacher. She never took any other music any music lessons other than from her father. And she went on to make all kinds of recordings and was really very popular, especially in Francophone Quebec, although she had a certain following also amongst the English. The next one is a poet, Emile Nelligan. Nelligan is a very well-known poet in Quebec. Again, he wrote mainly in French. He was a son of David Nelligan, who had been his father having been born actually in Dublin. The story of Nelligan is really a rather sad one. He started publishing his poems at 16 years old, but by the time he turned 20, he seems to have been suffering from schizophrenia, something, bipolarism, I'm not quite sure what. And his parents had him committed to what was called in those days an insane asylum. There's also some story that he was probably openly gay, which was probably not something to do, not something to publicize in those days. So they also say his parents didn't mind, they wanted to lock him up, not only for being schizophrenic, but also for being gay. But someone found his poems, and it would seem that after 20 years old, and he spent the rest of his life in a insane asylum, by the way, after 20 years old, when he was committed, he never seemed to have written any poetry again. But in 1903, someone found all the stuff that he had written, published it. He became, I guess, kind of an overnight sensation in the poetry business, but he himself may never have known how popular he became. So it is a bit of a sad story, but Nelligan was definitely of Irish descent on his father's side. Another person is Emile Coonan. Emile Coonan grew up where I'm talking to you now. I'm talking to you from beautiful downtown Point St. Charles. And Emile Coonan grew up just a few blocks from where I'm presently sitting. She lived in Point most of her life. The last few years, I think she went to live with an aunt, but almost all of her life she was here. She joined and became a member of what they called the Beaver Hall Group, which was a group of women painters that became very, very successful. Sort of like a female version of the Group of Seven. But she was unusual in that most of these painters, women painters, were Protestant and very wealthy. She was Catholic and not very wealthy. So she was a little bit different, but she went on painting, and she painted up to a certain stage in her life, and then she didn't seem to ever want to exhibit her paintings again. But they do hang in a number of museums around the world, including in the National Gallery of Canada. So she lived here in the Point until 1966 and then died a few years later. I guess as a side issue, just of some interest, is her brother was Thomas Coonan, who was a minister with a portfolio in the Duplessis government. And Thomas is blamed for the famous padlock law that went on in Quebec. It's a little long to discuss, but they were locking up businesses that basically didn't agree with Duplessis. I guess that's the way it seems to be. But Emile Coonan, great painter, pretty well known in the painting field, very poorly known, unfortunately, to most people in Quebec. But a lady with a strong Irish background. This one is a little bit of a stretch, I suppose, Genieve Bujold, but her mother was of Irish descent. Her mother was a Kavanagh, so she does certainly have some Irish heritage. Another one is an actress who became very, very well known at some stage in Hollywood. She was born in Montreal, mostly Irish, but she has some Scottish and British in her too. And she became extremely popular, went on to star in a number of films, and was really well known. Here again in the Point, there's a street named Shearer Street. It was named after her family. They own a lumber yard on Shearer Street at one point, and that's where the name came from. So she went on, and like I say, I believe she was at least put up for a couple of Academy Awards. I can't remember if she won some or not. The other interesting thing that she also had a brother, like Emile Coonan. She had a brother that did stuff on his own, and his name was Douglas Shearer, and he became an MGM sound man just at the time when movies were switching from silent to talkies, as they called them, and sound was starting to be used in movies, and Douglas became an MGM sound man. One of his big claims, which is quite interesting, is most of you, I'm sure, are very familiar. At the beginning of an MGM movie, you have the big lion that roars and makes all this noise. And that sound was designed by Douglas Shearer. And he has always said that he wanted the sound to be big and powerful for the movie or MGM, but he also didn't want to scare children. So he worked for apparently a long time, like a year, to get that sound of of the MGM lion making a noise. But both Norma and her brother Douglas were certainly English Quebecers, or English Irish Quebecers that went on to do some stuff elsewhere in the world. So those were people that were in the arts and entertainment. And then of course we have in politics. Now in politics, there were so many Irish in politics that it was a little bit insane to list them all. So again, I'm just gonna pinpoint a couple of them, but I do also like this quote. It's been said that politics is the second oldest profession. I learned that it bears a striking resemblance to the first. Said by Ronald Reagan. So one guy, let's talk about one guy, William Workman. He was a mayor of Montreal, 1868, of course, Irish. And he really, his big political philosophy was quite simple. He said a city like Montreal has to be managed for the benefit of all residents instead of businessmen only, which is the way it seemed to work at the time he became mayor. And he did a lot of infrastructure stuff. Now, infrastructure, listen, I agree, it's not really sexy, but it really is what's needed to make a city work. So he improved the streets, he drained a bunch of the lowlands, he changed some of the wooden pipe sewers, he constructed public baths, he set up the collecting of household refuge or garbage collection, and all kinds of other stuff, worked on the water work. So a lot of what we enjoy today came as a result of William Workman, who was quite a guy. And again, lots more stuff I could say about him, but I'll just move on here to Edmund James Flynn. I can't really say very much with Edmund James Flynn, other than I know his great niece, and I said I would throw Edmund Flynn into the mix here. So Edmund Flynn was the premier of Quebec, Irishman, of course, was there only about a year, came from the Gaspé, and was kind of an interesting character. He walked back and forth across the floor a couple of times, I guess, to find a party that suited him the most. And so he lasted a year, but he was kind of interesting in his own right. And of course, there was Sir William Hales Hingston. He was a doctor. He was also the mayor of Montreal. And he was very much involved, whereas Workman was really responsible for all the infrastructure benefits to the city of Montreal. Hingston did a really great deal to improve the health and sanitation of the city. Interesting, in the situation we are in today, he fought very hard to get people to accept the smallpox vaccination. It was tough. It was something like today. Some people didn't like it. Unfortunately, the Catholic Church didn't seem to be promoting it very much. And so there was a lot of people that didn't want to take this smallpox vaccination. He worked very hard to make it happen. So people who survived probably owe a debt to Sir William Hingston. And the next one in politics is, of course, Louis St. Laurent. Louis St. Laurent was Prime Minister of Canada, of course. He was born in Compton, Quebec, in the townships. And his mother was Mary Ann Broderick, also an Irish Canadian. So St. Laurent grew up fluently bilingual. They say his English actually had a noticeable Irish brogue. When he spoke, he almost sounded like he was kind of Irish from Ireland. But he always used gestures like hunching his shoulders, which, René Lévesque used to do on occasion. And they were kind of a French kind of a thing. So he was really Irish and really French at the same time. Louis St. Laurent was a great Prime Minister of Canada. And moving along, of course, in the political arena, we have Daniel Johnson Sr. and his sons. Very unique in that Daniel Johnson himself was Premier of Quebec. His son, Pierre-Marc Johnson, was Premier of Quebec. Daniel Johnson Jr., his other son, was Premier of Quebec. He himself was the son of Francis Johnson, who was an Anglophone laborer of direct Irish heritage, and a French-Canadian mother. He was raised fluently bilingually, but he was educated almost entirely in French. So I can't imagine, as most of you are aware, Daniel Johnson Sr. was premier under the party of the Union Nationale, Pierre-Marc Johnson under the Parti Québécois, and Daniel Johnson Jr. under the Liberal Party. So they all were premiers of a different political party. Well, I know my family, we can argue about the price of ketchup at a get-together, so I can't really imagine what kind of great discussions they must have had with their various political views. But both Pierre-Marc and Daniel Johnson Jr. are still support the Montreal Irish community very well. So they were a very nice family and they have strong Irish heritage. So I'm going to close it up now because I see that I'm kind of running out of time. But my own family, as I say, my great-great-grandfather arrived in the town of St. Columban, which is up near Mirabel Airport. So I couldn't see why I should not at least mention a couple of Irish Quebecers who were born in St. Columban and went on to do something in Quebec or in Canada. So without talking about my great-great-grandfather again, let me mention the first one, which is in St. Columban, there was Emmett Matthew Hall. Matthew Hall, again, an Irish guy, of course. He was a lawyer and eventually a Supreme Court judge, born in St. Columban in Quebec. And then eventually the family moved to Saskatchewan. He, along with Tommy Douglas, are considered the fathers of the Canadian Medicare system. And he eventually got appointed by Diefenbaker government to chair the Royal Commission on National Health, which became Medicare in Canada. Now, most of us, Medicare has been around a very long time. And I guess we kind of take it for granted. It's a benefit of being a Canadian Quebec citizen. But people don't realize that bringing it into Canada was something like the same problem they always have in the States these days when they try to nationalize the medicine. There's a lot of private interests, the medical profession, some doctors, and some insurance companies, etc., that fought very, very hard not to allow Medicare to become part of the Canadian benefit system. But Emmett Hall was an Irish kid out of St. Columban, and he knew a little bit about street fighting, and he won the fight. And so the next time you use your Medicare card, maybe to get your virus injection or whatever, just remember that a guy from St. Columban, Emmett Hall, was probably somewhat responsible for you having this free benefit. So the last person I'm going to mention is also from St. Columban. It's a whimsical little thing that I just wanted to close on. And his name was Timothy Collins. Timothy Collins has two claims to fame. The first claim to fame is that he lived to 111 years old. And it seems, from what I read, and I have various of these newspaper reports, as you see in front of me and on the screen, he seems to have been walking around the city of Montreal at 110 years old, smoking his pipe and just, talking to people, having a good time. When he moved from St. Columban to the city of Montreal, Montreal only had a population of about 43,000 people. But the other big claim to Timothy Collins, and I don't know if it's mentioned, and I have no way of proving it, I don't know if it's true or not true. When he moved from St. Columban to Montreal, he became a house builder, and has claimed that Timothy Collins is the first one that ever designed a house and put an outside staircase on it, so that those older properties around Montreal where you see the outside staircase, apparently it was his idea because he felt that that would give more living space in the actual residence. So Timothy Collins, 111 years old and putting up outside staircases. So I figured that that's as good a place as any to end my talk tonight. But let me just end with that very famous Irish quote, "May you be in heaven a full half hour before the devil knows you're dead." Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fergus. That was wonderful. You've really taken us through the Irish neighborhood of Quebec. And I didn't realize there were quite so many Irish that didn't have Irish names that were connected to Ireland in some way. I know you could go on and on. You mentioned before that you took the top 20, but that you could keep going if you wanted to. So I really appreciate that, and I will encourage people to come on now with open their cameras. That would be great because I'm sure there's going to be questions. So while people do that, I have just a little question for you. You keep mentioning your great great grandfathers. So I wonder if you could tell us just a little bit about him too, because he
Oh,
sounds like an interesting character.
came
Yeah,
from
I think he was. He arrived in the 1820s, and as I say, in a small community called St. Columban, which is up near Mirabel Airport. And in the time of the rebellion, pretty much all of the Irish that were living in St. Columban, and it was almost 100% an Irish Catholic community at that point, were patriots. They had meetings and they made a lot of patriot noise. I've always, from what I've read, I've always had a strong suspicion they were also at the Battle of St. Eustache, which was another fight between the British and the Les Patriotes. But most of the Irish ducked out when that fight got hot, mainly because they were probably a little more aware of how strong the British force was, probably the strongest army in the world at that moment. And then the British moved through the countryside after the actual battle and burnt down a few buildings here and there. So a number of the Irish of St. Columban ducked out of St. Columban and went to live in Ottawa so that they could be away from when the British came looking for them. Apparently my great-grandfather was not one of them. He just seems to have told them to take a hike. And as far as I know, they didn't burn down his property, but yeah, so he was, but all of those ones in St. Columban were quite interesting early Irish. And a number of them came into Montreal and became grocers, running big food operations and a lot of other stuff. There were a lot of guys out of St. Columban and stuff, you know.
Yeah, fascinating, isn't it? Yeah, no, you're right. There's so many of the Irish that whose names we might not know anymore, but they just contributed to to Montreal society, to Quebec society, and they were a community out there. But we've forgotten their names, and